Okay, and then at 3:05, we'll have you end the practice session. So just give us a couple more seconds.
I already ended the practice session.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. So as soon as we will let you know when it's 3:05, Adam, and you can begin. Okay, so have a good webinar, everyone. Go ahead, Adam.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our conversation today. My name is Adam Levine, and I'm the Executive Director here at the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council, or NYMTC. If you're joining us today, you have an interest in the topic of transportation safety and micromobility, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts, opinions, and experiences on this topic that is growing in importance to so many of our discussions about transportation today. Our session is the latest in a series of outreach efforts that are part of Moving Forward 2055, our regional transportation plan that is charting the course for transportation decisions in the NYMTC region for the next 30 years. These outreach efforts have included pop-up events across New York City, Long Island, and the Lower Hudson Valley, as well as a website survey that has provided thousands of comments. Our series of focus groups has also contributed valuable feedback for the development of Moving Forward 2055. And now we are focusing on individual topics in our series of forums, including recent discussions on freight, active transportation, and human services transportation. I'd like to introduce Stephanie Brooks to talk you through our format today. Stephanie?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. Just wanted to let you know what our meeting will be about today. But first off, start us with some ground rules. All of our participants will remain muted, and we're going to use a polling software tool to explore more ideas and get your feedback on your thoughts about today's presentation. So this platform is called Poll Everywhere, and I will be walking everyone through how to use it. You can always as well put your comments in the chat window in WebEx, and all of those questions will be incorporated, and we'll answer anything you have in the chat comment window. We are recording this workshop, and if you are an AICP, we are offering 1.5 credits, 1.5 credits from the American Planning Association, and I'll have a link at the end where you can find that information. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with WebEx, but just in case, the chat window is that little, to click that little bubble at the bottom to see the chat window, and you can type your comments in the chat window, and we'll be monitoring that chat to make sure that all of your questions and comments get recorded. And just so you know, our day today, we are going to just do a brief introduction about NYMTC, and then using the Poll Everywhere software, we'll have a little example poll so you can get familiar with the platform using your web browser, either on your phone or on your computer. We'll then have a discussion about safety and micromobility in the NYMTC region, have some more polling questions, and then brief information about the AICP at the end. So we'll have a little introduction about NYMTC, and I'd like to introduce Jerry Bogaz.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon, everyone. Although most of our session today will be interactive, going to give you a little bit of context about who we are and what the role of this plan is in federal funding in our region. So as you can see from this slide, NYMTC is a metropolitan planning organization. It covers New York City, Long Island, and the Lower Hudson Valley. And you can see some of the elements of our mission, which is a collaborative forum, facilitating informed decision-making by providing sound technical analysis, developing amongst our member agencies a shared regional vision, and importantly, ensuring that the region is positioned to capture the maximum amount of federal funds available for transportation improvements. Next slide. What's important to consider is that NYMTC is a regional council. It's made up of agencies, and we are staff to NYMTC. We're staff to this council, but this slide shows the council members. On the upper left, you have 5 suburban county executives from Westchester, Rockland, and Putnam County in the Hudson Valley, Nassau and Suffolk County on Long Island. In the upper right, you have the 2 New York City representatives, the director of the New York City Department of City Planning, and the commissioner of the New York City Department of Transportation. Right under that, we have the commissioner of the State Department of Transportation and the chief executive officer of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Those are our 9 voting members. We also have 7 advisory members, including the North Jersey Transportation Planning Authority and New Jersey Transit from across the river, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and of course the three federal oversight agencies, Federal Highway, Federal Transit, and the US EPA. Next slide. This is the region that NYMTC covers, as we said earlier, 5 boroughs of New York City and 5 suburban counties, 3 to the north in the Hudson Valley, 2 to the east on Long Island. Next slide. So the Regional Transportation Plan, which is updated every 4 years by federal regulation and provides a minimum 20-year planning horizon, is basically a plan that includes long-range and short-range strategies and actions for potential federal funding and investment in the future. And that all the projects and strategies that are considered for the plan must be within the confines of a financial plan, a long-range financial plan that is also developed as part of the plan. Next slide. Our members have proposed 6 goals, 6 strategic goals for the next plan. You see the areas they're in here. The goal statements are obviously a little bit longer than this, but these are the areas that they define: safety and security, infrastructure, resiliency, congestion, land use, and transportation equity. Next slide. So these goal statements and vision goals provide the strategic framework for the plan. And we also are required to provide a number of special elements, as you're seeing here. Pedestrian bicycle element, which is most related to micromobility at this point, coordinated public transit human services transportation plan, a regional freight element, an environmental justice and Title VI assessment of the plan and the planning process, and a section on environmental mitigation and new consultations. So these are all required by federal regulation. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Stephanie now. She's going to go through some of the particulars about Poll Everywhere, and then we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of this session. So, Stephanie.
Thank you, Jerry. So using Poll Everywhere, it's a simple software. All we'll need to do is use whatever browser you have. I'm going to put it into the chat, the link to it. If you see, if that link, there's a WebEx sometimes has a, click to proceed. You can go ahead and proceed, or just type in pollev.com/NYMTC, and that will, you'll click in your name. You don't have to, but it's if you choose to, and you just click continue, and you'll respond to questions and prompts. So our first question on the Poll Everywhere screen is, where are you participating from today? You'll see a place where you can drop a pin, or you just have to click your, someone is outside the region. That's anywhere in, elsewhere in Connecticut or maybe New Jersey. You can put a pin, someone's in Manhattan, great. So you see how it works. You just click your mouse or your finger on the location where you are, the county that you are in within the NYMTC region or outside the region. And I'll just give this another 30 seconds or so, so that people get some time to get familiar with the software. All right, we've got Rockland. Welcome, Rockland. Another Manhattan. Great. Give it another 30 seconds. So people get familiar with how this works. So we're going to use this throughout today's presentation to get your feedback on micromobility and your thoughts on the things that we discussed today. I'll give it another 20 seconds, see if we have anybody else. Again, you can always put something into the chat if you have difficulty with the poll or just prefer to use the chat, but the poll's fun. It's just kind of fun to see your feedback show up on screen in real time. And we have Westchester, wonderful. Thanks for putting it in. Okay, 10 more seconds. We'll take a little longer on this one just to get people familiar with how it works. Okay, so go to the next slide. The next slide is another poll, and that is a question about the organization you might be representing today. So are you representing, I see a private citizen, a federal, state, and local government, a consultant group? We have sort of like watching a race. It's feds and versus the private citizens and consultants. Do we have any public transportation agencies? How are we doing? Good. we usually have really good representation at these, so really looking forward to seeing where everyone's coming from. Give it another 30 seconds so people can click their organization representation. And when we say service provider, that's usually perhaps transit or any sort of micromobility service provider. That's what that means. All right, I'll give it another 10 seconds. All right, and then we have one last question just to get us familiar with the Poll Everywhere platform. This is what we're going to have a number of open-ended questions today where you can just type in your thoughts and your responses. So this is just a very general open-ended question here. What top of mind concerns do you have on the topic of this session? So micromobility, oh, wait, we need more safe ways of just getting, sorry, close my screen here, of getting around on micromobility. Great, thank you very much. So any other thoughts here? Just top of mind concerns, anything that you've like, oh, I've been thinking about this, or I want to hear about this, or I want to talk about this. Need for more bike lanes. Great, thank you. So we'll have this kind of question a few times for you to really put your ideas in here. And just so you know, all of this information is recorded on the back end. So anything you add here will be saved and recorded. So you don't have to worry about losing it. Safety of batteries. Oh, that is part of our discussion today. Thanks for mentioning that. Okay, we'll give it another 30 seconds or so. Abandoned scooters on the sidewalk. Yeah. Thank you. Perceptions of safety. Well, that is interesting. We're talking about safety today quite a bit. Okay, I'll give it another 20 seconds. See if we get some more feedback. All right, I'm going to move forward in our presentation. So you get a sense of what will be, how this Poll Everywhere will work. Last question, what type of community do you reside in or work or represent? An urban, suburban, ex-urban, rural community? Great, we're seeing feedback, thank you. Okay, thank you. So we have a good mix of urban and suburban. We haven't really received much ex-urban or rural, but we did for some of our meetings. So it's fascinating to see this NYMTC representation. Right, and also I'll move on. Thank you all for your participation. And now we are going to go into the meat of our presentation. I'd like to introduce Corey Hopwood at Cambridge Systematics to discuss safety and micromobility in the NYMTC region. Take it away, Corey.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thank you all for joining today on a very important topic. Good to see we have a good spread of urban and suburban representation since we're talking about micromobility, and that often, just based on where it is frequently implemented, kind of lands in our urban and suburban communities. All right, so I'll start with the next slide, Stephanie. First and foremost today, we're going to be talking a lot about micromobility, and the reason it's coming up is because as we move into the next long-range transportation plan, we're going to see kind of a shift from what we've looked at in the past, which is really just considered the pedestrian and bicycle element of our older plans, and move towards more of a comprehensive active transportation plan. And so that's going to cover not just walking and biking, but all of the micromobility options and mobility assistance devices that are out there. We know a lot of these things move a little bit quicker, but often serve similar solutions in our active transportation needs. And so we want to make sure those are included in the upcoming plan. Next slide. As part of this, the framework is shifting slightly to the topics that you can see on the screen. This is definitely a more holistic approach to addressing active transportation and goes well beyond what we have traditionally looked at in pedestrian and bicycle planning alone. Next slide. And so one of the big changes for that, like I said, will be including the element of micromobility. And for those of you maybe not as familiar with it, I want to provide a little bit of background on what micromobility includes. And again, it's those smaller scale modes, and we're talking specifically those conveyances that are assisting in active transportation, often at a speed below 25 miles per hour. They can be human powered, but often as we discuss a lot of the options today, we'll also be speaking to the electric powered micromobility options that are out there. And some of the typical ones that you've probably seen or heard of are the bicycle and scooter sharing systems that are out there, cargo bikes that are being utilized by some of our freight delivery and other delivery aspects, and then also e-bikes and e-scooters where that electric power assistance is coming into play. Next slide. And so to start off, just to get a relative understanding of who's in the room and you know what we should cover today, if there's any particular topics that we can hopefully help answer. First question is, what are your biggest safety concerns as they relate to micromobility? This is an open-ended question. Again, someone brought up perceived safety before, so this could be very wide-ranging, but please let us know some of your biggest safety concerns in terms of implementing or using micromobility. Sharing space, absolutely. From a safety perspective, sharing that space with those larger vehicles is at the forefront of everything we're doing in regards to kind of the federal push for developing a safe system. We're going to look for opportunities to hopefully separate the movements between those cars, trucks, and our micromobility devices. We understand the difference in kinetic energy can lead to our most severe crashes, so we'll definitely want to address that. Lack of guidance is another one. We'll talk a little bit today about potential education and some of the opportunities there, both on the devices themselves, through the apps that are being utilized, and also what can be done from more of a campaign perspective. Unclear traffic regulations, also a great one. I think a lot of the users, as well as those interacting with those users, maybe in motor vehicles, are unsure of what those regulations might be. And then speed. I think speed overlaps really well with that first discussion point of separating the space in which these users are operating. There's a large speed differential, not only with the cars and trucks that could lead to some kinetic energy differences and issues and potential conflicts, but also when they're interacting with, say, pedestrians, much slower speed on the sidewalks and intersections. Thank you all. Next slide. And so to get a little more detailed in our discussion here, we also want to talk specifically today about shared micromobility types. So there's a lot of various micromobility types. People own their own micromobility conveyances, but there is a lot in the NYMTC region in terms of shared micromobility, thinking about some of those station-based bikes through our bike shares like City Bike, dockless bike shares that's being piloted throughout the system. And then also scooter share and those dockless scooter opportunities. So there's a lot of systems across these three where, you know, they are combined in certain areas. Others we're still piloting and seeing how they're working and trying to determine what some of those obvious challenges might be. But here are the kind of the full range of options. We'll go through a little bit more on each of these as we move through the slideshow. And discuss a little bit more about where these are being utilized and how they have been in the past. Slide. Then we have another poll just asking if you have ever utilized any of those shared micromobility systems, specifically those maybe offered in New York and in the region. looks like a pretty high percentage, which to no surprise based on the kind of demographic information we got to start this of the urban suburban attendants. These are often, much more available to those of us living in those areas. So not a surprise to see a lot of folks are using them. And then Stephanie, if we have access, do you have access to the chat pod to ask if folks are selecting no here, is it more of a safety concern or more of an accessibility concern that's not led to you being able to use?
Sure. Go right ahead and put that in the chat. The why, if you did put no, if you can, just let us know why.
Yeah.
Is it just not available, or just lack of interest or time, what have you?
Absolutely.
I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
We did get one,
Interest.
safety and lack of interest as one reason why.
No, thank you, Bruce. That's very helpful. And anyone else that selected no, feel free to add your response there in the chat as well. We're completely open to hearing why. But with that, I will move on to the next slide just to keep the conversation going. So for most of you that said yes, and then I think there's also I haven't used shared micromobility option. How would you rate your overall experience using shared micromobility? So were you satisfied? Were you not? And then those of you that obviously haven't used it can select haven't used shared micromobility. I see Charles offered up the cost of subscription was also a barrier to using shared micromobility. Great point. Seeing a lot of satisfied to neutral customers. Okay. Mostly satisfied. Great, thank you all. Next slide. And so that being said, it looks like a large percentage of the folks on the call have utilized these shared micromobility options. And that also not just jives with the general demographics on this call, but also what we're seeing in the city for those shared micromobility options that are tracking their data. City Bike has been around for, I believe, 10 years now, and we're seeing a relative increase every single year in terms of City Bike ridership. We've also seen those additional modes emerging, so even more options, like we mentioned before, e-bikes, e-scooters, the like. So opportunities to utilize those types of micromobility are out there, and thus potential increase in services you all have been taking advantage of. But there's definitely others emerging where there's several system pilots that are going on across the region. Some of those may have been slightly slowed down by the COVID epidemic, but we have seen some scooter pilots in the Bronx and the Queens area. We've seen some bike libraries and similar less formal types of bike share popping up. And then just based on the legalization of e-bikes in the region, we've also seen that changing the number of available e-bikes out there and the increased usage as well. Slide. And so just to give a little bit of detail and benefit on each of the various types that I mentioned before, starting from the top, the dock-based systems that are available, they've become very, very popular, especially in the city where we have City Bike, we have docks available. They're regularly placed every 2 to 3 blocks, so they're very accessible and very frequently spaced. You can find them, easy to find. One, they're usually directly next to a sidewalk or some type of walking path, so you're not crossing traffic, and then easy to access the bike infrastructure that is near those stops or near those stations. They're regularly being rebalanced and having bikes placed back at the stations, especially at peak hours. They have understanding of where that ridership is going to and from, and they're able to restock those stations as needed. And that, again, that availability, that accessibility to continuously use the system from kind of where you need to go to where you need to get to is very important and very helpful in terms of increasing that ridership and why it's become so useful for folks in the region. It is available year round. That's also one of the reasons it's so accessible and utilized as much as it is. For those of us that are living here, and even for visitors that might come in the off season, having that available year round is a real resource that other places don't necessarily have, and may not be as easy to do with some of the dockless solutions. Next slide. Speaking of dockless, there is now also opportunities for utilizing dockless bikes and bike share. Naturally, some of the benefit of these is that they can be simply take over, parking spaces with something as simple as lines and paint. And that way there can be either stations on the sidewalk or spaces on the sidewalk, spaces on the street, in existing parking stalls. And that, again, allows for a lot more flexibility as opposed to maybe those larger stations utilized in the dock-based systems. And then there's also a lot of opportunities in terms of using the app and geofencing that are involved with the dockless bike shares. It can keep folks from parking in incorrect places and incentivize correct parking in the correct places. It'll keep you from going out of certain boundaries where the bike share is not servicing. It will also help riders better understand certain zones that they may be traveling through. So both from a benefit of understanding when and where to place the bike when you're done with it, as well as kind of enforcement pieces and education in terms of how to use it while you're on it. There's a lot of benefits to working and having a dockless system. One of those benefits on the next slide gets into the education piece, both on the dock-based and the dockless systems. There's a lot of opportunities to provide additional safety info, whether it's on decals that are actually on the bike shares themselves or the scooter shares themselves. There's also a lot that can be provided in the applications on your phone that you use to download or utilize these systems. That can include whether it's safety quizzes or agreeing to certain regulations and requirements. There's a lot of additional steps you can add for the users of these shared micromobility options to make sure that they're being compliant and safe when they're utilizing them, and also making sure that they're using them in a respective manner, putting them back where they should go, and utilizing them in the correct areas where the regulations allow. That being said, there's also some opportunities for in-person or virtual classes that have been put together, whether it's demonstrating how these micromobility options are used, or getting folks signed up, like when they're moving to public spaces like the park, to have the app to download the app, use it, and then be able to use these different options. But again, some of these, quizzes that maybe we're not seeing at the DMV level when we're getting a motor vehicle license are now available through other features in these apps and through some of the materials being shared. That way that users are still getting that initial education before they utilize these new systems. Next slide. One of the poll questions we wanted to make sure we asked as part of that, and because some of these types of micromobility are relatively new to the area, what types of education would be most helpful for you specifically when considering the use of one of these micromobility systems? There's quite a bit of information here. One is safety information that's printed on the actual device, hands-on classes or off-road test rides. Another option is short virtual trainings on street safety and how to operate these vehicles, free test rides, in-app quizzes, in-app Q&As similarly, and then any other free handouts or pamphlets at bike shops and other locations where potential riders may be stopping. So seeing a lot in terms of things that can be simply printed on the bike or scooter itself. Also some favoritism for the in-app options that I mentioned before, quizzes, Q&As to kind of get you started before you start to go on your ride. And then also free test rides. I think, again, yeah, that's a lot of It's what a lot of people are looking for in general when it comes to moving throughout the network, being comfortable with the types of devices you're using, and having someone there when you're doing those free test rides, great, but also just having an opportunity to maybe circumvent the subscription or cost of subscription to try it out and see if it's going to work for you to get to the types of places you want to go. I did want to ask on the previous one, for anyone that put free pamphlets at bike shops and other locations, if there are specific locations where those pamphlets you think would land with the highest percentage of potential users, please feel free to drop that in the chat. That would be greatly appreciated. And also thank you, Charles, for adding in some additional education options. Next slide. We also threw in a couple trends related to general crash trends over the last 5 years regarding bicyclists and pedestrians. This first one is focused on the bicycles. And if we were to draw a general trend line across each of the counties and each of the parts of the region, you'd see mostly a general uptick in bicycle fatalities and serious injuries over the last 5 years. A very, very, very small percentage of that would be contributed to e-bikes or micromobility in general. And while we don't have that data readily available, we do know that those crashes are few and far between relative to the general magnitude of what we're seeing in terms of bicycle fatalities and serious injuries. And so while bicycle fatalities and serious injuries are seemingly flat or on the rise, if we go to the next slide, we'll show that the pedestrian fatalities and serious injuries might actually have more of a downward trend line. And that's partially because a lot of us were likely walking a little bit more heading into COVID and during COVID relative to using some of those other options. But we will say that as micromobility and biking have increased kind of coming out of COVID in recent years, and more people are back to driving, those opportunities for conflict are likely one of the reasons that we're seeing that more upward trend on the bicycle side of these statistics. So something to keep in mind as we start to add some more of these convenient micromobility options. We also need to provide that education for both the drivers and the folks using them to make sure we can keep those numbers flat and then decreasing as we want to remove fatalities and serious injuries. Next slide. And so this isn't a problem that we haven't pulled you yet to ask about this question, but I know that there are general feelings around sidewalk riding and some of the safety issues there and conflict issues there with folks that are walking on our sidewalks, as well as safety concerns when these types of micromobility cross at intersections. So looking at how to mitigate this, first and foremost, New York City has made it illegal to use these scooters on sidewalks. Sidewalk riding in general should be discouraged, even if it's not necessarily a regulation legal. Based on some of the things we mentioned before, the difference in speed, weight, and that kinetic energy piece, as these riders interact with folks walking on the sidewalk, can be very dangerous. But there are some ways to hopefully detect this and mitigate this. I mentioned before the geofencing options for some of the e-bikes and e-scooters will allow the apps and the systems to detect some of that and not allow it. There's things, machine learning and other things that can help trigger those warnings when pavement conditions, change as you're riding along on that scooter to help catch that. And then there's also some camera-based solutions to help enforce that as well. So while we know it is a potential safety issue, there is a lot being done to try and mitigate that. And hopefully that will continue to improve and help the legality and safety of using these micromobility options.
Corey, and before we go on, there was just a quick comment in the chat about the graph that was previously shown.
Yeah.
That those graphs should be contextualized, that they might be minuscule when placed within the context of the growing number of miles and the number of persons using the devices. So that's
Absolutely.
That's
a great point. That's a great point from Charles. And that was kind of what I was trying to get at with as we see, pedestrians starting to level off from their fatalities and serious injuries and bicycles almost on the increase. That has to do with a lot more usage of these devices, a lot more people driving and having potential conflicts with these devices. So to Charles's point, yes, if normalized by the rate in which these travels are taking place, you would see that start to go more towards a declining trend. But still something, because these are our most vulnerable user types, something we definitely want to keep in mind. And also, you know, if we were to compare that to the relative number of motor vehicle crashes, to Charles's point as well, we'd see a, you know, very different level of magnitude. But that's definitely something we keep in mind as we start to develop this. It's not always the most readily available data to develop rates on in terms of the actual miles of travel, but we do understand that we're seeing increases in the need, want, and use of these types of modes. So naturally, that is going to lead to potentially increases in crashes that we'll have to try and mitigate.
And there was just a response from Jerry Bogas at NYMTC that the availability of the mileage and individual data is somewhat limited. So that does, to your point there.
Yeah. Thank you both. Next slide. All righty, another poll question. What types of programs and incentives would help you use shared micromobility systems on a more regular basis? Paul, I don't want to miss your comment about geofencing for cars so they can't go into bike lanes. I think that actually will be, I don't want to speak for the future of auto manufacturing, but as we move towards more automated vehicle solutions, I could see that definitely being a aspect of that. Hopefully not too wishful of thinking. And everyone, there's a new poll up asking what types of programs and incentives would help you use shared micromobility systems on a regular basis. This is wide open. So if it's, you know, covering that for, you know, free rides, subscription fee piece, some way to make sure it's safer, incentivizing, you know, and other ways to utilize it. Yep, congestion pricing. I assume that that's, you know, some of the subscription or cost barriers are part of it. Keeping payments as part of the Omni systems so that you're only making one payment for all of your transit and active transportation uses. Anyone else? Sorry, I know the open-ended ones take longer to type out. Equitable distributions of stations. Okay, great point. Making sure that the stations, especially for, it sounds like when you say stations, I'm assuming dock-based solutions are placed everywhere and with a better distribution so that everyone has access to them. Great point. I think we'll also kind of make that point in the coming slides where we talk about how it opens up your range of travel options, the distances in which you can travel when we're speaking specifically to some of the assistive technologies that can, you know, for the e-bikes and e-scooters where you can travel quite a bit further, quicker than we used to be able to on just a bike or on foot. Better geographic coverage, right in the same vein. Awesome, thank you all so much. Next slide. Alrighty, this one talks a little bit about the different regulations and recent regulations that are out there. I mentioned before the legalization of e-bikes in New York in recent years. You know, some shops had them, but people were nervous about purchasing them or using them, not knowing kind of, you know, based on ambiguity if they were really allowed to use them before 2020. But now that's allowed for those shops to sell them quite a bit more frequently. New York also adopted the 3-class system that's popular in a lot of other parts of the country. So that helped kind of push that as well and really set forth what bikes should be allowed. And then also having some consistency in the region so folks aren't having issues when they move from one county to the next or one jurisdiction to the next when they're using these types of micromobility. Next slide. And here's one of the main benefits that I think I was alluding to in the previous poll. By having e-bikes and by having the e-scooters, we're kind of expanding people's mobility range. We're reducing a lot of barriers to getting to different locations than maybe we typically had walked or chosen to bike to. You're not going to physically exert yourself as much. It's sort of some of those geographic barriers, such as hills or bridges, that you might not want to walk over. And, you know, generally decreases that travel time. So there's a lot of interest there, and one of the main reasons and benefits of having these types of options. The next slide is another poll regarding that, asking if you've specifically using an e-bike versus some of the other shared micromobility that we've talked about. And I'm assuming that a lot of the folks that have said they've been using micromobility or use shared micromobility were probably referring to either the bike share or e-bike share. Looks like about 2/3 of folks have tried out the e-bikes. While the others that say they haven't, say they do not have access to an e-bike. Consistent with what we were hearing in the comments before. Geographic coverage. Next slide. And for those of you that, I guess both, even if you've used them or if you haven't, do you feel like an e-bike would make you more likely to bike in your community? A lot of yeses and a few maybes. That's great news. Happy to hear that folks are for e-bikes. Next slide. Talking a little bit about the safety and operations around using e-bikes. We had talked before about trying to separate those users, not just e-bikes from motor vehicles, but also e-bikes from folks traveling at lower speeds. We do know that to implement this, it does potentially take a lot of space. E-bikes are moving very quickly, so we do need to provide them, you know, pretty sizable space in terms of their own travel way. Again, that separation is ideal because of the mass and speed differential. We talk a lot about kinetic energy in the safety world and how to reduce it and avoid conflicts in those giant differences in terms of kinetic energy. And we have some actual examples of, you know, different ways to implement that separation on the next slide.
There's just a chat comment that I think Central Park should have a slow and fast micromobility lanes in the loop. It's a great suggestion.
Great timing, Paul. The next slide actually talks about the Central Park separation a little bit. And while it's not set, it is a discussion. Before I get to that one, a couple other examples. Como Bridge has a shared use path. And while there's no real physical separation between the active modes, it is still available. It is still providing you know, designated lanes for each. It is fairly narrow, so the comfort of that bidirectional travel isn't really available like it might be in other locations in these other examples. But there is access to that general shared use path separate from the travel way. So that's, you know, kind of the starting example. Moving up the way, we have the Brooklyn Bridge bike path and promenade that have now separated the cyclists from the pedestrians and helped change up that speed differential and the issues we had seen with that, where folks really couldn't bicycle on the pathway because there were so many pedestrians. and vice versa, is making the pedestrians feel safer. There's not someone biking at a much higher speed in the same travel way. And still maintaining that separation from vehicular traffic that we're seeing across all of these. And then to Paul's point on the Central Park Loop, there is a lot of infrastructure and right-of-way to work with there. There is a wide path that keeps cyclists and pedestrians separate from any other traffic already. There's ample space for a lot of users using those various modes. So kind of that single direction for where cyclists should be traveling. And so there's not quite yet a separation for those faster micromobility, e-bike type micromobility options, but there is discussion of potentially exploring or making room for lanes for those faster micromobility options in the future. Next slide. Paul had a question or a comment about a PDF on this particular topic. So back to the Central Park high speed, low speed micromobility lane options. Stephanie, I don't know if we have an email at the end of this that Paul can send that to, or a form in which he can share that.
I'll put
Absolutely.
an email in. I'll put an email in the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
And then one of the other safety issues that's been coming up a lot lately is for e-bike charging. There were a lot of, especially coming out of COVID, a lot more of the delivery apps using more and more e-bike delivery to get those various, restaurants and grocery and all those things delivered. And some of the lower cost e-bikes that are out there are maybe not as regulated, not having proper certification, running on particular types of batteries and having issues with fires and with injuries and even a few deaths as well. So those issues have been noted. The city is taking steps to prohibit the purchase of those types of e-bikes that are not certified, including this law from September, to try and make sure that only those certified and accredited devices are available to avoid those types of fires and those types of injuries. And then additional rules have been put in place as of February of this year as well. Next slide. And then looking at safety for more of the infrastructure side for e-bike charging, the city's adding quite a few accessible charging options at a lot of the priority destinations where they know these are being utilized a lot in hopes of making charging safer. These are going to come out in a set of destinations along with some bike parking, noting that a lot of the e-bikes will require a dock or a larger outlet for charging purposes. Next slide. And the last piece we want to talk about here was driver education in relation to these users. We know that driver education in general is relatively static. It's rare that new information makes its way into the driver tests and those types of things. So there's certainly no mention currently of the micromobility or e-bikes. So there's opportunities to hopefully improve that, get some of that in there, but also use some of the other educational options out there to share that information. That while the micromobility options and technology themselves aren't in the driver's manual, there's also not a whole lot of information on how the roadway has changed in regards to these types of users. So whether it's the leading pedestrian, bicycle intervals, different mixing zones for that type of traffic, things like pedestrian scrambles are not included in that type of literature. So finding other ways to kind of share that out would be helpful in terms of letting drivers know what to expect and when to expect these different contexts, so that they're not, surprised or confused when they encounter them, and allow for a much more fluid interaction. It does need to be, with that, we'd like to think the driver education does need to be reframed a little bit, noting that while operating a car in those multimodal contexts. There's a lot of risk for those vulnerable road users. And understanding that again, it doesn't have to be in terms of that kinetic energy differential, but just the protection and relative differential in terms of safety for those very different types of users, and how a vehicle might interact with these multimodal options or active options. So I think that's it for our presentation piece. I think for the most part, we are into just polling questions from there. The first one being, in your community, are there unique safety concerns related to micromobility? I know before we kind of asked if safety was an issue or a barrier to utilizing micromobility. Are there specific safety concerns for your community when it comes to utilizing these modes? Too many cars, too many potential conflicts with cars, motor vehicles? Any other specific safety concerns for your community specifically? Lack of appropriate transportation network and lack of driver awareness. So kind of touching on that last piece, the education for motor vehicle operators, lack of enforcement of those rules. So making sure that when folks are not following the regulations, that there is enforcement to help with that. For the lack of enforcement piece, is that relative to the users of the micromobility or the motor vehicle operators interacting with that user infrastructure? If you don't mind putting that in the chat, whoever said that. A lot of attention on the fires.
The lack of enforcement was also from law enforcement. It's just a little follow-up in the chat.
Okay, from law enforcement that are using these modes. Anything else on this? Sorry.
Just a follow-up that
First
the
clarify, yeah.
law enforcement does not know how to enforce the laws for micromobility. Okay, thank you
Okay,
for
so-
following up.
Education for enforcement. Okay, got it. Great point. Alrighty, with that, we'll go on to the next slide. A question about what types of destinations or areas would you like to be able to access through micromobility services? So before we were talking about, if you had access to more of these micromobility options, would you use them? And if so, where would you be more likely to go using active transportation than before?
Sorry, what is FNB? I apologize, I don't know what that means. We could put that in the chat.
Someone else put the commute to the office or commute to work. Stations, visiting friends and family. Recreational locations like parks and trails. Anything else? Any other destinations of interest? Food and beverage. What was that?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
very
Kevin.
much. Thank you.
Alrighty, next slide. Next is what types or forms of information would be most useful to you for knowing about available options and safe ways to operate micromobility options? some more information about what's out there and what form of info, how would you like to have that information delivered? Or what form would you like that information to be in? So, you know, it's out there. Social media, that's a big one. Having information at the point of purchase. A regularly updated website. Anything else on the types of information you'd all like to see? All righty, next slide. Are there any other constraints to communities implementing micromobility? I guess going beyond the safety considerations we already talked about, safety is obviously one of them, but are there any other constraints that might be keeping communities, your community, from implementing micromobility? Political support, political will. Something that consistently comes up in the active transportation and safety discussion frequently. A lack of responsibility from the vendors. Is that from a maintenance standpoint? Is that from a educational standpoint? When you say lack of responsibility, anything particular there? Subsidies to incentivize the purchase of these devices. Yeah, we talked a little bit before about that and what could help incentivize the use of these, and that's a great point. All righty, next slide. All right, so that's the end of our presentation. If there's any additional questions, please feel free to throw those in the chat. I'd be happy to try and answer them. Also going forward, there is a web portal for the plan underway. The website is listed there, and Stephanie also just placed it in the chat for you. Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, everyone.
And you see here our link to, if you'd like to get AICP credits for this session, I will also put that in the chat along with our website for Plan 2055. And you're very welcome to go to the APA website and just log in today's course. It should show up if you are AICP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie, Corey, Jerry, the whole team. Really appreciate everybody's work on this. Thank you, everyone who attended, and we look forward to seeing you at some of our upcoming events. We have one on alternative energy sources on June 4th, curb and parking management on June 11th. These are all topical forums we hope you'll join us for, and transportation and technology on June 25th. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.